he's bound to come back to those old claims. He wants the territory. He will say that Ukraine has to neutralize in some form, or at least can't have a security guarantee from the United States, can't have European or other troops on its soil. It seems to me, bound to come back to those kinds of demands. And then it switches the pressure to Zelensky and Ukraine, whether they calculate that their future with both Europe and some doubt about how much support it can provide, though Europe has done better than many of us would have expected. But whether Trump will then say, well, this is really your fault, and use that as an excuse for not continuing to support Ukraine, that'll be the calculation for Zelensky and the people around him in Ukraine.
President Trump has said American officials are heading to Russia to discuss the proposed 30-day ceasefire in Ukraine. President Zelensky has said everything now depends on whether Russia wants to stop the fighting after Ukraine agreed to the ceasefire deal in talks with the US yesterday. The American president does appear to have threatened sanctions if Russia does not accept the deal.
In a financial sense, I can do things financially that would be very bad for Russia. I don't want to do that because I want to get peace. I want to see peace, and we'll see. But in a financial sense, yeah, we could do things very bad for Russia. It would be devastating for Russia, but I don't want to do that because I want to see peace. And we're getting close to maybe getting something done. We've got Ukraine done, and as you know, I've always said that Ukraine might have been the more difficult party. You were here a week ago when some interesting things happened. I had somebody that didn't seem to want peace.
Well, the British Defence Secretary John Healey's been meeting European counterparts in Paris to discuss a coalition of the willing for a possible peacekeeping force. But on this programme earlier, John Luff, former NATO representative in Russia, now head of foreign policy at the New Eurasian Strategy Centre, said he thought the plan was unrealistic.
I think it's pie in the sky, because the Americans are not going to provide the security guarantee that the 15 countries that you refer to are going to need to have, because Europe can't provide this on its own. So I just don't see how this can happen. Now, if let's say Putin digs his heels in and annoys Trump, doesn't go for a ceasefire, and then Trump pins the blame on the Russians for the failure of the peace process, then we might see, the American sentiment change.
Well, Greg Treverton is former chair of the US National Intelligence Council under President Barack Obama. Good evening to you, Greg.
Good evening to you.
Well, all eyes now really on Russia and President Trump pressuring them, suggesting that there could be heavy financial penalties. What is your sense? Do you think that Russia is going to agree to this deal?
I think it'll depend on how much Putin is willing to do a little something for his friend Trump. Now, the idea of more sanctions is certainly damaging to Russia, but as we've seen, they've managed to evade the worst effects of the sanctions for quite a long time. And we know that sanctions take a long time to bite. So in that sense, it's not an empty threat, but it's a threat worth making. But I think this will turn on both the battlefield circumstances, whether Putin thinks that 30 days of time to regroup and re-equip would be useful, and really how much he values at least some possibility of resetting relations with the United States.
But if President Putin does sign up to it and then uses the 30-day ceasefire to regroup and then to attack again, I mean, that would be a disaster, wouldn't it?
It would be. That would be an awful outcome. But it is hard to imagine at this point the basis for a longer-term ceasefire. As I said, mostly what Putin has an interest in now is seeing if he can reset or rebuild relations with the United States. He doesn't really have much interest in ending the fighting. He's not doing badly on the battlefield, and he has the possibility that the United States will not follow through with continuing to provide arms and equipment to Ukraine. So he's not in a bad position. The difficulty, I think, of his position is really how he wants to handle his relationship with Trump.
It seems quite likely, doesn't it, that President Putin will come back with his own negotiating position. We've been hearing suggestions that he's likely to say, well, look, I've claimed illegally, of course, those four different parts of eastern Ukraine, which are partially occupied by Russian troops. Russia has laid claim to them. President Putin presumably is quite likely to come back and say, look, we're going to keep control of those 4 provinces. We want to, as the Russians call it, neutralize Ukraine. That potentially means perhaps getting rid of President Zelensky. And of course, the Russian foreign minister has been very clear that he doesn't want to see foreign troops on Ukrainian soil. I mean, if those are the demands, it's going to be very difficult to find a meeting point, isn't it?
I think it is. And he's bound at some point, even it might have an initial ceasefire, but then he's bound to come back to those old claims. What's the territory? He will say that Ukraine has to neutralize in some form, or at least can't have a security guarantee from the United States, can't have European or other troops on its soil. It seems to me, bound to come back to those kinds of demands. And then it switches the pressure to Zelensky and Ukraine, whether they calculate that their future with both Europe and some doubt about how much support it can provide, though Europe has done better than many of us would have expected. But whether Trump will then say, well, this is really your fault, and use that as an excuse for not continuing to support Ukraine, that'll be the calculation for Zelensky and the people around him in Ukraine.
What about this idea of a coalition of the willing? The British Prime Minister Keir Starmer is convening a further meeting at the weekend. We've had the Defence Secretary John Healey talking to European counterparts in Paris today. France saying that there are at least 15 countries willing to get involved. Do you think it is realistic for countries like Britain, France, perhaps Poland, Finland and others to mount a credible peacekeeping force if the US is not prepared to provide security guarantees?
It is impressive, and I think that it is sincere. And it could work, I think, though Zelensky always says the ultimate needs is something from the United States, a security guarantee from it. But it might be that if the Europeans were prepared to go to actually stationing troops in Ukraine, so Putin and other Russian spokesmen have said that's verboten, but if they're willing to go that far, it might at least be a starter. It's an impressive performance so far, and in circumstances where Europe is not in great shape with both Macron and Germany in difficult political situation, but it is impressive, and it's at least a good sign. Certainly, the Europeans have had to take Ukraine much more seriously because they've had to deal with Trump and the possibility that he won't. So that, I think, is a good sign. And that may be the beginning of something. That if the Russians will come off a little bit and say, well, as long as there's no Americans and we have some guarantees that this is purely a peacekeeping force, who knows? Who knows? And again, it comes back to where Putin thinks he stands in the war overall and where he wants to stand in his relations with Trump and the Trump administration.
Greg Treverton, former chair of the National Intelligence Council. Really good to speak to you. Thank you so much for joining us.